Welcome, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Helsinki. My name is Terhi Mölsä, and I'm the CEO of the Fulbright Finland Foundation. I want to warmly welcome you to the 8th session in our global webinar series on internationalization of higher education in the COVID-19 era. Over the past several months in this series, we have explored a broad range of critical topics in international education, from diversity, equity, and inclusion to health and safety to online learning. Inevitably, in each discussion, sooner or later, the focus has shifted to partnerships, because partnerships lie at the very foundation of international education and are critical to our ability to respond to both the challenges and opportunities. Today, we focus specifically on international strategic partnerships and engagement. We have over 280 registered participants with us from 34 countries, literally from around the world. Thank you for joining us. Your engagement throughout the webinar is important, and we will soon suggest several ways to do that, so be prepared to participate. Our goal is to critically examine how COVID has impacted and changed partner relations and partnership models. In doing so, we will ask, how can international strategic partnerships evolve in order to survive and thrive? And are all strategic partnerships really strategic? Or should we re-examine and rethink the fundamentals, including what strategic means to us and our institutions? We've agreed in the previous webinars that one should never waste a good crisis. So today as well, we want to challenge ourselves to envision how the current crisis can impact partnerships and engagement in the broader sense for the good. We're grateful to have with us two experienced partnership professionals from both sides of the Atlantic to challenge our thinking and to discuss and share their insights, experiences, and practical tips with us. Jane Gatewood is Vice Provost for Global Engagement at the University of Rochester, New York, in the United States. Recently, she edited a guidebook on international partnerships published by NAFSA, Association of International Educators. And Anna Grönlund is Head of Internationalization and Higher Education Policy at the Division of Policy and Planning at one of our foundation's partner institutions, the University of Jyväskylä here in Finland. In addition to her various roles on the national level in Finland, she's a board member of the AIEA, the European Association of International Education. Welcome, Jane and Anna. We're really pleased to have you both with us and look forward to the conversation. From funding to programs to infrastructure, our own foundation's entire operation is based on partnerships with governments, universities, research institutions, foundations, and other key organizations. And I can't think of a better moderator for today's topic than our Assistant Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives, Lisa Weimer. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to our entire events team here in Helsinki. Finally, I want to say that throughout this global webinar series, it has been a pleasure to work in tandem with our webinar partners, the USA Study Abroad Office of the US State Department and AIEA, the Association of International Education Administrators. Thank you for modeling in practice what a smooth and impactful public-private partnership looks like. And now I want to turn it over to the Chief of USA Study Abroad, Heidi Manley.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Terhi. And as always, thank you and your team for being such a terrific partner along with AIEA and for joining us on this collaborative experiment as we convene higher education experts around important topics on the internationalization of higher education in the COVID-19 era. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us here today. I am so pleased to be here with you on behalf of my USA Study Abroad team at the US Department of State to open this important conversation on international strategic partnerships and engagement. In 2020, we saw borders close and international academic mobility interrupted. Our partnerships have been tested, and we have had to reimagine the international education landscape. We are now at a point where we need to ask, how can international strategic partnerships survive or thrive? This webinar addresses the importance of higher education and the important role of partnerships globally. From my view, there are so many of us at the State Department and in your own institutions who are working tirelessly to support an even stronger return to student mobility, not only in the number of American students studying abroad, but to see more American students studying abroad who truly reflect the diversity of our country. And I believe we all have a shared determination to build back better and stronger. In our globally connected world, international education matters as we tackle issues of critical importance, including public health, as we all became even more painfully aware over the past year. American student mobility is an important component of our commitment to the importance of people-to-people connections between the United States and the people of other countries, as is welcoming qualified international students to the United States. The backbone of this is through our partnerships. What are the current challenges of maintaining and building educational partnerships that are meaningful and beneficial to both institutions? What are practical tips for reflecting on the main goals of strategic partnerships to guide future relations as we look ahead? And what role do partnerships have with consideration to important issues like access and equity? I am thrilled to have two voices here today to tackle these questions and to offer perspectives from their respective sides of the Atlantic on what strategic partnerships mean. Thank you both so much for being here today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our fantastic moderator, Lisa, to begin today's conversation as we have so much to learn together. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Terhi. I'm Lisa Weimer, the Assistant Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives at the Fulbright Finland Foundation. A big hello from sunny Helsinki to all of you around the world. I've been watching the chat function here, and it looks like we have individuals from Puerto Rico, Massachusetts, New York, also Finland, I saw a few, from Portugal. So we are truly an international group, so welcome. The format of today's webinar is discussion-based. Throughout the discussion, you can submit questions in the Q&A function. So you can find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you want to click that Q&A just so that you know where it's at and how to use it. You can submit your questions at any point that you have for the panelists by clicking here and submitting your questions. And this function also allows you to view other questions and vote and comment on them. So we encourage you to be interactive with the Q&A function. There's also the chat function, which you can also, it looks like some of you have already been playing with that function, which is great. This is where you as participants can interact and connect with one another. And we encourage you to do so throughout. Just to note, by default, all of the chats are to the panelists, but what you'll want to do is if you have the chat function open, you can see at the two, it says all panelists, and you'll want to change that to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your message. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. We also encourage you to tweet using the hashtag IntelLedC19. And without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the discussion with our speakers. So in previous webinars, we have discussed how this Corona pivot that we are all doing has impacted and shaped various aspects of international education. And so, Jane, I'm going to start with you. If you can get us started with the discussion, would you like to share with us your thoughts on how strategic partnerships and engagement have been impacted and shaped by the pandemic?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to you and Fulbright Finland and to the Study USA US State Department for inviting me to be here. At the University of Rochester, we are a very highly productive in research, and a lot of our high bandwidth relationships abroad have been in the research domains, and particularly in areas that are our strengths, our research strengths around optics, photonics, and also in medicine, health. So, you know, in the disciplines that have required mobility, such as optics, photonics, physics, astronomy, where researchers are traveling around the world, and researchers, I also include students, because we have students who participate in many of these research engagements, those individuals have been largely grounded by this travel, and so by the pandemic. And so that has really arrested some of those relationships and caused, you know, more or less a hiatus. We are beginning to restart research mobility now, but the collaborations continued virtually. And so I think the researchers tried to go through the data that they had collected and figure out what they could analyze and produce. And it was a time to refine and move through the data that they already had. But on the academic and curricular side of relationship engagement, we've actually increased our activity, in part because we had so many students located around the world in their home countries who were not able to travel to Rochester to undertake their degrees. And we engaged with many institutions in other countries, as I'm sure many of our colleagues on participating in the webinar did as well. And so we figured out ways where we could have students engaged and do shared delivery of courses, do have students enrolled in partner institutions, not sort of as what we would call exchange students, but they're in their home country, but they're treated as exchange students. And so a lot of that went underway. I think that it was much easier with institutions that we had existing strong relationships with. We were able, I see Anna's nodding her head. You know, it's always easier to build on a relationship of trust in a time of crisis. A time of crisis is a challenging time to begin a new relationship. That said, we did it, and I'm sure many other places did it as well. And we reached out to partners that were perhaps lesser known to us, or we had not worked with as much, and asked for their help, and received incredible amounts of help from colleagues around the world. So I think that it's been a time of shared strife, but also a time for people to really think about, you know, in education, we do share and promote mutual understanding. So the relationships have been different. I will say that prior to the pandemic, I have been talking with a number of colleagues in the US, at least, about what we call partnerships, and you know, partnerships that are high bandwidth. High bandwidth is a term I often use. I saw Susan Sutton in the attendees list, and she has a great term for these of generative partnerships, and partnerships that sort of produce new initiatives due to the relationships that exist and the complementarities that exist between the institutions and the trust that is gained. I've noticed in the US a little bit of a stepping away from the term strategic or strategic partners out of fear that it marginalized some relationships or some individuals who are involved in the perhaps non-strategic relationships. And so I'm wondering what others in the webinar do. I think we have a poll that we could ask the participants, what, does anyone use the word strategic partnerships, and does your institution call them strategic partners? That would actually be enormously helpful to me as just someone who works in this space. I find it to be a useful term, but I also know that it has some nuance that may be marginalizing in some circumstances.
Yeah, so as you can see, everyone on your screen, there should be the poll that has popped up. So if you mark your answer, both of them are yes or no, so this should be a quick one to answer. And then we can have Jane and Anna comment on the results. And also, I think, Anna, it'll be interesting to hear the European perspective on this. Is there also this movement away from that language or not?
Yeah,
Okay.
and perhaps just to echo what Jane already said about her experiences and her institution's experiences dealing with the pandemic, I can only echo your experiences. They were very similar here as well. But jumping into the definition of strategic partnerships, Lisa, do you want to go over the poll results first before I?
Yeah, so it looks like, the majority does still use this language, strategic partnership, 76%, and 56% call them strategic partners. So what are your thoughts about that? Anna, do you want to start with that?
Sure, thank you. I think the word strategic is sometimes used quite liberally without kind of much consideration to what it actually means. It's kind of a buzzword and has been for a long time in higher education. And I think when we want to kind of signify the importance of something, we tend to call it strategic, like what Jane was saying earlier, that we have these strategic partnerships and then we have these other partnerships, but does that mean that they're less important? But I think that if we were to just define strategic partnerships, maybe we could define them by first making a distinction between making strategic decisions about a partnership portfolio that might include both strategic and other partnerships, and without making any sort of like value statements between these different types of partnerships. And then if we think about specifically about strategic partnerships that are actual strategic partnerships, I suppose that the typical definition of a partnership of that kind would be that they're kind of long-term, sustainable, durable partnerships based on mutual interests and objectives, and also commitment to collaborate on a range of activities, from teaching and learning to research and innovation and outreach, and activities that are really connected to the strategic core objectives of partnering institutions. So and I suppose that even kind of a more structured, deeper strategic partnerships, in those types of situations, the partners might also be committed to some type of shared resources. And I suppose that in any case, some kind of reciprocity or mutual understanding of the nature of the partnership is really the key.
Okay, and Jane, what are your thoughts about the results?
It's interesting. I saw kind of a little bit of a difference between, institutions have strategic partners, the majority, so 3/4 have what they would refer to as strategic partners, but they might not, just over half call them strategic partners. So I'm curious what some of the other terms are. Do people call them priority partners? I saw in the chat that someone called them collegial partners. And Anna, I liked your I think you brought out a really important point, that making strategic decisions about a portfolio of partnerships is what often we're doing when we talk about strategic partners. But it's really more of developing a partnership strategy than having strategic partners. And strategic partners might be an outcome, but again, I agree with you that that value statement about the nature of the partnership can sometimes be chilling to the others who don't fall into that, for lack of a better term, bucket.
Exactly.
Category.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good point, because I think we hear this often about the strategic partnerships, but what does that actually mean? So I think, both of you bringing this up as kind of like the beginning of our discussion is really important as we go further and deeper into the conversation. So Anna, I want to pitch this one back to you. How have partnerships and engagement been shaped by the COVID-19 era? What is your perspective in Finland and in Europe? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think both just partnerships and also strategic partnerships have all been impacted by the pandemic. We've not been able to fulfill mobility goals as expected, and research projects have been put on pause for a while in certain fields, like Jane was describing earlier. But I think that probably the strategic partnerships have been in a better position, that the cooperation in these types of partnerships is backed by kind of stronger institutional ties, and perhaps they're also based on a longer shared history, so that they have a better chance of surviving a disruption like the pandemic. And it might be that they come out of it as even stronger partnerships because of this shared experience, where they've had to kind of, or the institutions have had to kind of go beyond what they initially maybe thought getting into that partnership. And I think this is an experience that many institutions in Finland and across Europe are sharing.
Yeah, in our first webinar that focused on the future of international education, one of the speakers, Cheryl Matherly, she discussed the importance of partnership relationships from two different perspectives. So the first one, authenticity. And she said that has really changed with this crisis, is that the relationships with partners have developed deeper because you're meeting the children, you're meeting the dog, you're meeting the cat, you're in your kitchen having these conversations. So maybe it's a little bit more relaxed. And then the second thing that she said that the pandemic has impacted is this realization of dependency and how dependent we are, because we've been thrust into these crisis situations where we really had to come together and think strategically of what to do. Say, for instance, study abroad programs. Do the students need to come home? Can they safely stay? Can they still study? So it really makes us realize like this dependency on our partners. And so Jane, I want to pitch this one to you. How have partner relations been shaped by this new virtual existence that we are all living in?
I think there are a lot of positives that have emerged. I would agree with Cheryl that there's a level of perhaps informality that is maybe for me, speaking personally, it's welcome, in that we're able to all be in this crisis together and try to help one another. And I think that builds trust, which is core to any relationship. And so we've been able to, I think, get to the core objectives of a relationship more quickly. We've been able to move those things along much more quickly than perhaps we would have done previously if we relied on mobility and face-to-face engagements to move a relationship forward. And I would encourage us to think about that going forward. Are there ways that we can reduce the travel by administrators perhaps, and refocus that mobility on the students and on the researchers? And can we front end some of this, connections about resources and how to engage, and you know, the kind of speed dating that occurs at conferences, but then is often followed up by a visit. Visits will still occur, but I think that there might be opportunities to curtail them, and rather than have a grand tour that is deeply unsustainable from an environmental perspective, we might be able to do more engagements virtually, and I think that's something that's very much needed. I also think that we've relied to some degree on networks. And I think before COVID, there are a number of international research mobility networks that exist around the world. And I'm sure many on the call are also part of them. Some work well, some struggle to find their footing. It's often challenging to get 20 to 40 institutions to all agree on collaboration and move in the same direction. So, you know, bilateral collaboration or trilateral collaboration has often been much easier. But I think that the pandemic has highlighted the need for multilateral engagement. You all may have seen recently, I think 50 plus presidents signed a joint pact to address the UN's SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that may not have been possible if we were relying on people to fly and coordinate presidential schedules and arrive in the same place and sign that and move it forward. And there, everyone was able to convene on Zoom, agree, sign this, push it out, collaborate with UNESCO, and really prioritize the objectives over some of the formalities. And that's not to say that we don't need some of that formality, but I think this is an opportunity to rethink what is critical in that space of the formality. And equally, many of the vaccines that have been developed through network collaboration, and clinical trials run all over the world. So I think it really highlights the importance of a networked approach to research engagement. I think our students are looking to enter global networks when they graduate our institutions, and these are things that I think we can all help them with. So I would actually project that post-COVID, we're going to see probably a little more virtual collaboration to ignite and sustain relationships. And we will also probably see a new era of networks and coalitions coming together around core challenges.
Okay, so this is interesting, Jane, because you're talking about, you know, these kind of newer models that are emerging, and maybe the importance is shifting a bit on kind of this network idea and that sort of thing. So Anna, what are you seeing in Europe as far as new models of partnerships?
Well, first of all, I think in Finland and in Europe in general, higher education institutions have been quite quick to adopt digital solutions for teaching and learning, especially, and for research collaboration as well. But I do think that there's a certain resistance to kind of fully embracing the possibilities of digitalization, claiming that international collaboration can only happen truly in a physical face-to-face encounter. And in a way, I feel like this is perhaps quite understandable. There are challenges, especially in launching any new initiatives and starting new partnerships from a distance and without all the kind of informal elements of negotiating and launching cooperation, which we have kind of grown used to in the past. And I also think that the concept of digital divide is still very real, and a skills and infrastructure gap can be seen even in Europe and in the so-called global north, both on institutional and individual level. I'm not a big fan of generalizations, but sometimes it seems to me that in terms of new technology adoption, the global south has perhaps been faster than the north, for example, in adopting mobile technologies, which are, of course, shaping collaboration and partnerships in a fundamental way. So these are probably some issues that I would keep an eye out for in the future. And I absolutely recognize what Jane was describing earlier, this kind of shift to multilateral and network-based collaboration. That's something that we see both in Finland and in Europe. And there are even funding instruments nationally and on a European level to support this type of activities. So this is clearly visible here in Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. And I want to go to this idea of virtual engagement because Anna, you talk about digitalization. And, you know, our previous webinar was focused on the virtual student experience. And one of the speakers, John Mario Bassana, he said, and I quote, "Lack of co-location does not mean lack of collaboration." And so now that we've kind of all had this taste of online collaboration and this Zoom existence, do you think that this will change the way that we think about future collaborations and partnerships? So I'm going to pitch this one to you, Jane.
I mean, yes, I do. I think that it's I'm going to reiterate some of what I said, but I know that some of our research partnerships already use various technology functions to remain engaged with their partners throughout the year, even if they're not on site or in the locale. They might use WhatsApp. I know that they use WhatsApp groups to communicate a number of resources. I think that as administrators of this work, we often we may need to catch up a little bit with some of the things that our researchers and that our students are already doing. I'm optimistic that we won't all be on planes all the time in the future. I think that's really important. We were beginning to talk about that. I think at the last EAIE, I know it's been a topic considerably about what does global environmental sustainability look like while we're also trying to promote mutual understanding and people-to-people exchange, and how do we balance those things that seem on the face of it diametrically opposed, but I actually don't think they are. I just think we have to figure out ways that we are, again, focused on when is it critical, when does it need to happen, and when does it complement, but are there other ways that we can remain engaged? And we have a wealth of technology that allows us to remain engaged more regularly. I think keeping up with some of it is more challenging. So I do think it's going to change how we engage. And I agree with John Mario's statement that is very well articulated, that co-location doesn't mean that we don't have collaboration. So the task really is to evaluate what works and retain it, and rather than just assume that we're going to revert to a pre-COVID mode of engagement. I don't think we will, but I don't think that we're going to just keep what we've been doing for the past 15 months either. I think that there's going to be some sort of removing the chaff and figuring out where the grain is, and keeping some of the core elements that are critical. I can't say exactly what that's going to be. I'm sure that virtual engagement in this type of form is going to continue. I think conferences are probably going to go into a hybrid space. I think perhaps some of the study abroad disciplines that have been challenging to provide opportunities for, such as engineering or some of the STEM disciplines, we may have new opportunities here for students to remain engaged in some of their courses at a home institution while studying abroad at a partner. I think there are all sorts of new hybrid ways that we can really think through engagement.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think that another, actually, this is really timely. There's a chat here that's talking about also the equity perspective when we talk about this virtual engagement. And this individual says, in our work with Venezuela pre and during the pandemic, we found amazing adaptability of the partners and almost a more equitable third space created because of the pandemic strain on global North bandwidths, utilizing phones, apps, etc. It wasn't perfect, but it was very, very much evidence that blended modalities bring more equity and inclusivity. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, it's beautifully stated, and it's absolutely, from my perspective, accurate. I will say that the highlighting the challenges of bandwidth is critical, because we also can't assume that everywhere's networked, and if everywhere's, so there are challenges to virtual engagement as well. But I do think it highlights the equity issues and brings, I do agree that it brings an opportunity for more equity in the space. Anna, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I think I agree as well. And I think virtual engagement has been kind of on the European higher education development agenda for a long time, even before the pandemic, and for many reasons, really. Some of them might be climate change reasons. Some of them might be accessibility reasons, and accessibility is something that is connected to the idea of equity. And I feel like kind of due to the fact that we've seen these digital and virtual solutions brought or bring added value to partnerships in the form of new activities and indeed open kind of international experiences and collaboration for a wider group of students and staff, even within Europe, because there are certain obstacles for some groups of students for engaging in this international experiences or student exchanges or student mobility. So now that we're kind of entering this exit or recovery phase of this pandemic, I think it's exactly what Eugene described, that it's time to start reflecting on what modes of collaboration that we have kind of adopted during this time, and very quickly, and sometimes even ad hoc, are worth holding on to, and which might bring added value to our partnerships in the future. And I think this will be part of a reflection process that many institutions will go through later on this year and going forward. And I think this idea of reaching larger groups of students and perhaps also larger groups of partners around the world is one aspect that we will be looking into.
And Anna, I'm curious, so the Erasmus program in Europe, which is equivalent to, say, study abroad in the US, that has gone virtual, is that correct? Or what's the situation with that?
Well, virtual in the sense that it's digitalization and virtual solutions are one focus point in the program. And like I said, it's been on the kind of European higher education agenda for a long time. And I think now with the pandemic, there's a certain impetus or pressure to bring it front and center in the development, but what the practicalities will look like and how we will measure mobility numbers or partnership collaborations in the future, and how they will be shaped, that still remains to be seen, I think. So okay. A lot of uncertainties there.
Yeah. Well, I want to get some engagement from the audience on this topic. So we have another poll. Sophie, if you can launch the second poll, and this is about virtual engagement and how it's shaping future partnerships. So if everyone wants to have their say on this question, what do you think will happen in the future with virtual engagement?
There have been some really thoughtful comments in the chat about equity and inclusivity and collaboration and growing together. I'll have to remember to save a copy of this chat. It's really, there's a lot of thoughtfulness happening.
Yeah, and just a reminder for those of you who are engaging in the chat, if when you look at the two, make sure that it says to all panelists and attendees so that your message can also go to the attendees, because the default is panelists. So that would be great. And also I want to remind everybody that you're more than welcome to submit questions for the panelists in the Q&A function. So if at any moment you have a great question that you want us to ask, please submit that. And let's go to the poll results. So it looks like people think that virtual engagement will shape future partnerships moderately. What do you think about that? Do either of you want to reflect on the results here?
I agree. It's hard to make a statement that we will have a radical shift immediately, because perhaps this is hopefulness. We've been through such a radical shift. I can't imagine anyone's hoping for yet another radical shift. But I do think that, following what a number of people have said in the chat and what our conversation has been, there will be a period during which we will consider what works well and what worked well during our forced immobility, right? And what needs to be mobile and what can be virtual. And I think that will be the moderate shift. And we will of course travel. We need to travel. We need to meet people and see how they work and live and study and engage. But we also can ignite things and catalyze things and steward things virtually. And so I think that's likely right.
I think I agree that there's likely to be a moderate impact, at least, on the way we move forward with partnerships, especially. And I think perhaps when we're a bit further on in this recovery phase or exit phase in this pandemic, and we've had time to kind of reflect on what happened, not just within our institutions, but with our partners, we'll see what the actual impact of this will be, and how it will really shape the activities and operations of our partnerships going forward.
Yeah, and many of our previous webinar speakers have talked about how the pandemic has allowed us to have this moment of a paradigm shift for international education, kind of this moment of pause as far as no travel, right? And reflect on what's important to recenter practices that focus on outcomes that matter. And as Terhi said in her opening remarks, you never waste a good crisis. So taking this as a moment of opportunity to really take that pause and do some reflection. Anna, I'm going to pass this one to you. Have you seen this paradigm shift happening with partnerships? And if so, how is your institution reassessing? Or, I know that you're working with AIEA. Are other European colleagues talking about this moment of pause and what it's doing?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in general, all institutions should evaluate or assess their partnership portfolios on a regular basis. But this pandemic has definitely made us more aware of which partnerships are vitally important for us, in the sense that they're deeply connected to or aligned with our strategic core fields or core activities and operations, and which partnerships are perhaps less so. So I think that this pandemic can definitely serve as a kind of a partnership pressure test But I think instead of making any hasty decisions in the middle of all this, I would approach it as a kind of a conscious activity, perhaps a little later on when we were able to kind of look back with a bit more perspective. And I talked about strategic development in another event for the EIE a couple of weeks ago. And I talked about kind of the institutional strategic development, where we usually work with scenarios and scenario play in which we kind of test different strategic approaches and their viability in different future scenarios. And in a way, I feel like a comparison can be made where this pandemic has been kind of a real life scenario that we are playing in real life. And this experience, once you're kind of able to maybe step back a little bit and reflect, will then help us make strategic decisions about partnership development as well. But I would stress that something that I've noticed happening at our institution, but also happening in other institutions in Finland and in Europe, is that we really need to get out of this first and then reflect and then make decisions, and not make any hasty decisions now, when we're still kind of in recovery mode and working our way through this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jane, what are your thoughts about this?
The thought that we've had time to contemplate doesn't resonate with me very well, because I don't feel like this has been much of a time for contemplation. But I think that what this has done, at least at my own institution, which has a tendency that I've been trying to realign, to engage more transactionally. And I've been trying to realign that to think about long-term relationships wherein we have deep trust, and to figure out where those, I know that we have those relationships already, and where do they exist. So on the first point, I think that the pandemic has showcased the importance of trust, and the importance of trusted partners and relationships, and to the senior leaders, deans, et cetera, and has really highlighted the need for these long-term. I think faculty have been aware of this need and have worked in this domain for a while, but I do think that there's a heightened institutional awareness now for the need for deep relationships that can grow stronger through and last well beyond a crisis. But I also think that given that we are doing many different things now, and we are not perhaps hosting visitors or hosting delegations or doing I've been able to pivot some of my team to do deeper dives into our institutional information, that so that we can have better understanding of where are our points of connection around the world, where are our research connections, where are our faculty co-authoring. And so we've been able to amplify some efforts on institutional data analysis, and which helps with partnership identification and cultivation and development. So those are some things that the teams that perhaps were dealing with mobility and with a lot of student engagement previously, we've been able to kind of refocus on some of this institutional analysis and during this transition. So that is something that I would, if institutions aren't doing that now, that might be something that can be done, especially as we're refocused on less on the actual logistics of mobility and more on where are our relationships and how do they look and how do we steward them. I feel like I steered a little away from the question there.
No, I think I'm just reflecting back on Robin Helms was in our first webinar, and she talked about this term, scrappy creativity. And it's really this idea that we are kind of in this moment, right, of trying to figure out what to do. And Jane, I think it's interesting that you said that some of the people in your team have kind of pivoted. So maybe they were more focused on, the mobility side of it, and now they're doing more kind of deep dives. And that is a reflection in itself, isn't it? That is kind of a reassessment to go, okay, are we doing what we should be doing? Is our international efforts aligned with our strategic goals as an institution? So I think that this does take, it does offer an opportunity to, even with that Corona pivot, to maybe do more of an institutional analysis and that sort of thing. Anna, what are you doing at the University of Jyväskylä? Have you, kind of done this pivot, this reassessment?
Well, this type of institutional analysis, or kind of a data-based or knowledge-based decision-making, is something that, or it's an approach that we use in our decision-making process anyway. But like I said earlier, I think kind of the time for a more detailed reflection on our partnership portfolio will come perhaps a little later on, when we're safely out of this situation where we are right now, where we kind of need to put our focus on getting through our kind of core activities. But definitely looking at like a wide set of different types of data, and also maybe applying type of scenario building and scenario play in building future relationships and future partnerships might be something that we might be engaging in the future, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I hear from both of you that you haven't necessarily had this time to reassess your partnerships, right? We're still kind of in this crisis mode in a sense. But let's hear from the audience here. We have one last final poll. And so, Sufi, if you can bring that up, and we can have the audience give us their perspectives on this reevaluation of its partnerships, and if people have really had the time to do that. Yeah, and I'm really, the chat is very active, so I want to continue to encourage you all to continue to chat with one another and give your thoughts. And there's also opportunities to ask questions. So if you want to submit a question, you can go to the Q&A function. All right. And here are the results. So about 60-40. It'd be interesting, though, according to what both of you say, it'll be interesting to see what happens to these numbers, maybe in a year or two, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other reflections on these results?
It's not, I will say it's not terribly surprising. It's actually affirming, to see that we're all largely in a space of contemplation and maybe not contemplation, maybe that sounds more relaxed than perhaps the space we're in, but reevaluation, and but also acknowledging that there's still a large minority that are, we're all kind of muddling along here. It's, so I think that this has been, this is a watershed moment, I think, for higher ed generally, and the international components of higher ed more broadly. So it's certainly a time for us to grab onto what works.
Yeah. And I think it's so nice to have someone kind of representing the European region, and then Jane representing the US. And so I want to kind of clue into that a little bit more. this transatlantic discussion about strategic partnerships. So I'm curious to hear from both of you. What are the trends in Europe and the US in regards to partnerships? Anna, we can start with you. What are you seeing as important shifts or innovative practices when it comes to strategic partnerships or partnerships?
Well, Lisa, I think one of the clearly kind of identifiable trends or shifts has been for the past decade already. I think that institutions are perhaps no longer looking to add more and more partnerships in their portfolio, but instead kind of focusing on a smaller or moderate number of partnerships that are functional and meaningful and active, and perhaps more strongly aligned with the kind of institutional strategic objectives as well. So the kind of less is more approach, I guess. And we talked a little bit about the Erasmus program earlier on, and in Europe, it's really the Erasmus program and the Horizon program, which are the EU funding frameworks for international collaboration on education, research, and innovation. They played a significant role in shaping the way strategic partnerships have developed and will develop among institutions in Europe and beyond, I think. And one of the most kind of recent flagship initiatives in this so-called Macron initiative, named after the French president who initiated it. The official name is European Universities Initiative, which is aiming at building strong long-term strategic network alliances among European universities. It's a fairly recent development, but will surely shape the way partnerships are developed in Europe. And it's already been proposed that non-EU universities could be included in these networks in the future. So on the European level, I think this is something that, kind of going back to what Jane mentioned earlier, that we're moving into this network-based and multilateral-based collaboration. And you can see the same thing happening here in Finland as well, where the majority of the university's funding comes from the government. And we just launched a new national strategic funding instrument for internationalization. And one of the key objectives or goals or activities in this instrument is to build stronger strategic collaboration networks with partners in Africa, China, India, and the United States. So I think these two examples kind of highlight the trend of moving from purely kind of bilateral partnerships to a more network and multilateral based approach, I guess.
Yeah, that really goes hand in hand with what Jane, you were talking about.
Yeah,
earlier.
exactly.
Yeah, and can I add to that, Lisa?
Go ahead.
I think that also, if we're thinking transatlantic, that's, we're really focused on the global north, but I think that what we have to do is perhaps collaborate together to engage more overtly and directly with the global east and the global south. If we look at demographic trends, the global demand for higher education is going to increase significantly, and the majority of that demand is coming from the global south. So I think a networked approach could really be quite beneficial to meeting that demand and not just relying on students moving from the global south or the global east to the global west or north. And so I think there's some really rich opportunities for the places that have had more infrastructure for higher education delivery to collaborate with areas that have current more demands. And it's a little farther afield, but I think that this goes back to thinking about what are the SDGs and what are the core challenges that are facing the world. And, provision of higher education is one of them. And I think we're going to have to take a networked approach. A onesie, twosie, one by one approach is really just not going to meet the global demand.
Yeah, very, very, very good. I want to move to kind of this practical perspective. So for both of you, with kind of this next phase of what COVID-19 is going to bring us into. No one really knows with the vaccines and the new variants. What practical tips do you have for developing partnerships? If you were to give any tips to our audience members, what do you think you'd give?
I can, well, sorry, Anna, were you about to start?
No, go ahead, Jane.
I always say that sometimes we think about what do we want in a partner, but I actually encourage people to invert that and to think about, know yourself, know your institution, know your strategy, know what your objectives are. And in knowing your institution, to go back to kind of a previous comment I made, use this opportunity to mine your institutional data and mine your institutional information if you can. If there's a slide I have that shows kind of some of the data elements that we've utilized to help us understand our international connections. Can we get that slide?
Yeah, Maya, can you update that slide there? Yeah, that will come here.
Great. So, a tip I always try to offer people is in knowing yourself, try to think about what types of information is gathered at various offices or points of connection around your institution. And can you, during this time when we aren't necessarily facilitating student or faculty mobility, can we redirect some teams to engage with those offices and find these data elements and begin to norm them and bring them into a common database so we can understand what these are. I know a lot of institutions are very far along with this type of sort of inventorying and mapping projects, but if you're not, or if you're adding new domains, this type of information can really help you understand where there are centers of gravity for your institution, either in certain geographic domains, as well as in disciplines and in specific institutions. So that's a primary core tip that I would offer.
Great, thanks, Jane. And we will have this on our website as well for individuals that want to see this after the webinar. Anna, what do you have? What practical tips do you want to give?
Well, I can only agree with what Jane just said, and the slide that she shared. I think with existing partnerships, it's important to kind of regroup and reflect on the shared experience and make joint decisions of the way forward. And I think this requires what Jane just described, that the partners have a clear understanding of their institution-specific objectives and goals for these partnerships and the ways that these may have changed in the course of this pandemic. And I think this information and this understanding is very important for the establishment of new partnerships as well. In the kind of more practical tips that I was thinking, I think very clear and reciprocal communication has been of paramount importance during this time, I think, and it can only be kind of emphasized in the future. And I would also emphasize kind of the importance of clear administrative and support service processes for international collaboration. On a very practical level, this includes clear decision-making processes and division of tasks and things that have really been put into test during this pandemic. And I think also perhaps last but not least, I think all institutions have had all kinds of crisis response plans before this pandemic, but I'm not sure how many of these have really taken into account a crisis of this magnitude. So these plans probably need to be revisited and reimagined. And I think partnerships should be examined in this context as well, as we've seen and what Jane described earlier, that we've become so dependent on our partnerships as well during these times. So they need to be put front and center into these plans for future. Someone said in the chat that this pandemic is probably not going to be the last one that we see. or the last crisis that higher education sees in the future. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, and the pandemic has certainly also kind of, we've all realized like how globally connected we really are. I mean, this is, you can really feel it, right, with the pandemic. So it's also been a moment for us to realize the importance of international education and international research, you know, sharing vaccines and this sort of thing. So it's been an interesting moment for international education and what the pandemic has actually meant to what we are doing in our everyday lives. You know, there's some questions that just came in, but I'm looking at the time and we are running out of time. There's one question that I want to really quickly pitch to either of you if you have a quick answer to this. And that is, where are the global leading practices for meaningful exchanges and consortia? Do either of you have any quick answer on this?
Is shameless self-promotion allowed?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just going to mention EIE as a resource for kind of the European perspective on things. Their website is, or our website is a great source for information and perspectives from different corners of Europe and shared good practices from the European perspective and beyond. We have many members and contributing people from outside Europe as well. So EIE.
Continuing in the frame of shameless self-promotion, the book that came out this past summer that I edited and contributed a chapter to from NAFSA has considerable information about how, you know, it's more of a guidebook for partnership development. So NAFSA's Guide to International Partnerships. As well, there is a ACE, the American Council on Education. They have an Internationalization in Action series dedicated to partnership development and different modes of partnerships. So I would encourage there are, I think, 5 different publications in that. They're all free on the ACE website, and those can be downloaded and accessed as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for those resources. So I'd like to ask one final question. If you could briefly answer in a minute or two. Anna, I'm going to pitch this one to you first.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on the future of international education? What will it look like post-COVID in 5 or so years?
You know, Lisa, I think that there's a simple answer and then a bit more complicated answer to this question. I think the simple answer is probably that everything is fundamentally changed and nothing is the same, but I'm not sure if I believe that myself. I think the more kind of complex answer or perspective to this question is that the needs and kind of motivations for institutions and individuals for engaging in international collaboration are still the same. We believe that international collaboration is an essential part of our existence as higher education institutions and people in these institutions. It brings added value and it enhances the quality of our education and research and boosts our innovation activities. And from a global perspective, the way out of this pandemic is possible because of international collaboration in science. So the importance of international education and research collaboration is only emphasized, I think. And from an institutional perspective, I think the importance of meaningful strategic partnerships is likely to grow, and institutions will most likely focus on developing strategic partnerships that can survive not just the test of time, but a global crisis like this, once we have that time to reflect and build those portfolios. And I think we might also see new features and added existing partnerships and expansion of partnerships to stakeholders beyond the higher education sector take place more in the future. So these are probably my main points.
Okay, Jane?
I think that the future is going to allow us to realize and allow many beyond ourselves as international education practitioners and administrators and educators to realize that education is always will be and always has been international. Education is an international pursuit. Scholars have always crossed borders and boundaries to pursue education. And I think that COVID has highlighted that our world is deeply networked, and our education systems are deeply networked and highly globalized. And I think that this perhaps is an opportunity, and has been an opportunity for many across our institutions to realize that depth of connection internationally that perhaps wasn't highlighted before. So I think the future is different, but I do think that there will be greater awareness across our institutions for the role and importance of international and global engagement and thinking internationally as in every area of the institution.
All right, very good words to leave us with. There was somebody who was asking for the resources that both of you gave, like ACE and EAIE, and we will go ahead and put those on our website, so you can go there after this event and you can see the resources there. But a sincere thank you to both of you. Anna Grönlund, Head of Internationalization and Higher Education Policy at the Division of Policy and Planning at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. Thank you so much. And Jane Gatewood, University of Rochester in New York. She is the Vice Provost for Global Engagement. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. And, I think just thinking through some of the main takeaways that I got from this discussion is, Jane, you had mentioned this is a watershed moment. And I think that there's no better way to really sum this up. And I think it was really evident from both of you that, we're really not in this space of reassessment yet because we're not out of the crisis yet. And so realizing that, I think, is important. But taking the moment, Jane, what you had said, to really know your institution. So doing some inventory and mapping projects in this moment is a good use of time when we don't have faculty and students traveling. And I really think it's interesting, this movement towards networks and multilateral partnerships. And so this is something that we should all be mindful of and really think through, what is this going to look like in the future? And then I think, Jane, you had also said, really aligning partnerships with these core challenges that we are all facing. So looking at SDGs and kind of these wicked challenges of the world, and seeing what we're doing in those areas is always a smart way to go forward with partnerships. So really appreciate it. And I hope that the audience feels like there were also some really tangible takeaways. Before we sign off, we'd like to invite everyone to the next webinar in our series. Registration is now open for the next webinar, which is May 5th. And please note that these next two webinars have limited capacity because we're going to be offering a very unique opportunity for participants to explore prospective partners via partnership speed dating. So sign up today and join us for this innovative networking adventure. We will also send you a follow-up email that includes the recording and an invitation to these webinars. Also, we really appreciate your feedback. So as you leave, you will be prompted with a quick 3-question exit survey. So please take the time to give us your feedback. We would really appreciate it. And finally, on behalf of the Fulbright Finland Foundation, as well as the collaborating team at the Department of State's USA Study Abroad Branch and AIEA, we thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.